Welcome all. I'm joined once again by CivilNet host and analyst Eric Hacopian to discuss the latest developments regarding the Armenia-Azerbaijan peace process and Russia's play in the region. So, Eric, thanks again for your time.
It's a pleasure.
I want to start off by talking about a meeting between the Russian Speaker of Parliament, Vyacheslav Volodin, and the Azerbaijani parliamentary speaker, Sahiba Gafarova. It gained a lot of attention. First off, let's look at Gafarova's comments. She was praising Russian President Vladimir Putin for all his efforts with regards to the Armenia-Azerbaijan negotiation process. It was interesting because on other occasions Azerbaijani officials have complained about Putin. So which is it? Are they praising him or complaining about him?
Well, at this point they're all on the same page. I mean, what you're really seeing and what that meeting showed is the clear nature, and other comments, especially by the foreign ministry spokesperson, that we're dealing with a very clear Baku-Moscow axis that is geared towards that gears against Armenia and the West in general, and specifically Armenia's turn to the West. And I think this meeting was a perfect example of that.
Okay, and Vyacheslav Volodin, who is the Russian parliamentary speaker, he made his own remarks during the meeting, which gained a lot of attention in Armenia especially. He stated basically that those who apply to European institutions and involve them could risk losing their statehood. Many saw this as a veiled threat to Armenia. He actually went on to say, look what happened in Ukraine, which many saw as well as a threatening remark. We believe he was referring to the EU civilian mission, which has just been deployed to Armenia, and Russia has expressed its angst over this. What did you think of Volodin's remarks, his threats?
Well, it was not an implied threat; it was a threat. I mean, if you listen to what he says, he is. They see any EU involvement as a threat to them, and specifically, this is problematic for them because, you know, as we know at this point, they very likely green-lighted the September 13th attacks on Armenia. And the reaction of this is the Western move and the EU mission and all of these different things. So this Western presence at this point makes their joint projects that are geared against Armenia more difficult. So this is a practical problem. But this is... you know, if anyone's dug this hole, it's themselves. They're the ones who created the situation, and now they're complaining that you're acting independently to come up with processes that will help you defend yourself or help you tell your story to the world better or to make new alliances. So they create the problem, and then they get mad that you act on it. And the fact that both of them are on the same page and that Russian officials are always talking about how the EU mission is here without Azerbaijani approval. And the fact that if you listen to, as far as the road closure in Artsakh goes, Russian spokespersons from Lavrov down have never criticized the closing of the road. They've never criticized the regime in Baku. What they have always done is said the road should open, without saying who's closed it and why it shouldn't be closed. And which tells you that this is coordinated down to a T. The reality is, if the Russians wanted to open this road, they could open it in half an hour. So this is obviously, this is the telltale sign that what we're seeing, and specifically with the closure, is a joint country project that's geared towards essentially the Armenian state in this particular government and Armenian statehood in general.
And it's interesting that you speak about this Moscow-Baku tandem, because even though Russia's relationship with Armenia is very complicated, it is quite clear that Azerbaijan wants to present to the world that Armenia is this rump state of Russia, this satellite state, ally of Russia. Clearly there is some capital to be had, especially as Russia's reputation has been tattered by the invasion of Ukraine. So in your opinion, how does Azerbaijan want to portray Armenia to the world, especially with regards to its ties with Russia, and what is in fact the reality?
Well, it is, as you said, they want to show Armenia as a rump puppet state of Armenia, as Russia's. And then they used to say, well, there are other lines where they're just as corrupt as us and they're just as undemocratic as us, but no, they no longer can say that. But the reality is, if you look at Russian actions, and if you look at what the Russian government officials constantly say, that simply is fantasy. Now, does this fool people that are have sort of historical memory and don't know what's going on or don't follow things closely? Yeah, because, oh, well, Russia, Armenia, ally, things of that nature. But generally, it doesn't really fool anyone who's in the decision-making circles, because they already know what the reality of the situation is and which direction, that Armenia is moving in the Western democratic direction, and Azerbaijan is part of the, the authoritarian axis in this region. Or in the world. So that's their narrative. The other one that they always do is this ally of Iran, because if the Russia narrative is falling apart, the card that they hold is that, we're fighting against the Iranian regime that you hate just as much as the Russians. But that's an even harder case to make, because there's actually no formal political or alliance or military alliance with Iran. It's just simply an open border and, reasonably neighborly relations. So this is this part of the narrative telling. I'm not sure how successful it is, given the realities at this point, when it comes to decision makers, when it comes to broader public opinion, to the minimal extent that people care about this region. I'm not sure how effective it is.
Okay. And World Energy Weekly, a publication of PetroStrategies, a French think tank specializing in energy issues, as well as other media outlets, have been spotlighting an issue which I want you to give your comment on. They've been publishing investigative pieces about how Azerbaijan is basically laundering energy to Europe from Russia. So obviously, because Europe and Russia cannot be seen to directly trade in this way, they're funneling it, it seems, through Baku. A cunning strategy, in your opinion? And on the other side, doesn't that show in a way Russia's growing dependence on Azerbaijan?
Yes and yes. I think you're highlighting a very important issue. That laundering, by the way, has yesterday, in addition to that article, there was a big article in the Guardian, the London Guardian, in which talked about, because there's the actual laundering of Russian gas and oil that comes through Baku, through the BTC pipelines and other pipelines. And the other one is essentially oil shipments directly to Turkey that are processed in Turkey by SOCAR, which is the primary Azeri oil company. So this laundering happens on both ends. Actually, it's the raw oil and gas, and then the laundered material, the laundered oil that's turned into jet fuel and other things and sold. So they're actually laundering in both places. And I think what's critical here is that there's a tendency, especially in Armenia, to limit Russian-Azeri relationships just to Artsakh, and it's just far greater than that. They're actually involved in elaborate financial schemes with each other. In this case, laundering Russian oil. So that's actually, money that's going to fund Russia's war in Ukraine. And it's being done by Azerbaijan. It's being done by Turkey in this case. But the company, despite the fact this is in Turkey, the company is actually owned by, it's actually an Azeri company. So there is a dependency and there's a clear alliance. So their interests coincide not just in many places, not just in preserving these authoritarian political systems, but also in real business terms. And lastly, is a good part of the stolen wealth from that country is actually in Moscow. Yes, a good part of it is in London and Dubai and other places, but it is well known that Aliyev's family owns extensive real estate holdings in Moscow. Some of the most valuable properties or homes that are in the $20-30 million range. So this is a very deep alliance that goes way beyond simple things and partially, but it's generally geared against Western interests and against democratic development in this region.
And I also want to ask, what kind of Armenia do you think the Russian state would like to see, and what is problematic for them about the current Armenia?
What they want to see is an Armenia that is poor, weak, isolated, unable to defend itself, undemocratic, and have a government that has no legitimacy. With the last one being the key phrase, because in this region, when governments have no legitimacy, they have very little room to act independently of Moscow. So what becomes your legitimacy comes from your affirmation or your relationship with Moscow, which is very much the case of the old regime here before the revolution. Well, we're good with the Russians, so we're good on the security front. Don't complain about other things. So those are the 4 or 5 things that they want. They want a country that is marginalized, needs them, cannot make its own decisions, has no agency. That's what they want. And the problem with this current government, which, as you know, I'm personally quite critical of sometimes, is because it isn't some of those things. The government has legitimacy, whatever we might think of it, on its day-to-day actions. The country is more democratic than all of its neighbors, and it is economically developing in other directions, and it's creating political and security relationships with other people. So on all of those fronts, it's problematic. But I think, frankly, almost any Armenian government, given post-September 13th, would have no option but to do these things. So they have this tendency where they create, it's like this the cheating husband that cheats on the wife, and then they complain that the wife does something about it. And this is exactly that kind of relationship.
Mm-hmm. I also want to ask, you say that Russia green-lighted the September attack in 2022. It green-lighted the blockade of Nagorno-Karabakh. And then we hear threats from high-ranking Russian officials. As Armenians, as an Armenian community, should we be scared of these threats? Should we take them seriously? How should we behave around this sort of language?
You should take them very seriously. But should you be scared about them? No, there's no point in that. It's just you just have to come up with practical ways of dealing with it. You can't live in terror of these things, and at the end of the day, that's the price you pay for independence or creating a normal or creating a not failed state. Mm-hmm. This is the direction that you have to go in, but it's not going to be easy. Your existence and your ways of doing these are problematic for other regional powers in this case. But at the same time, I think part of the all of these, if you look at this, all of these efforts to undermine Armenia, this particular Armenian government or Armenia in general, have actually not succeeded because the blockade did not force the Armenian government to run to the Russians. Well, what do we need to give you to solve this issue, which is what they wanted. The Russian political position in Armenia has entirely collapsed. No one speaks favorably of them. At best, they'll say, well, we need to have reasonable relationships with them. So what they're trying to do isn't working. And I think part of the problem is that they have a hard time dealing with political systems that have democratic features, is because it's not, public opinion in Armenia matters. Public opinion in other places doesn't matter. It's not the only thing that makes decisions, but when the public sees this as something that the Russian state is lined up against it, the reaction is not to say, well, what do we do to appease them more? It's like, well, what do we need to do to have other options? So fundamentally, these attempts are failing, but at the same time, people are paying a real life price for them, whether it's our soldiers who got killed in the attack or people in Artsakh that are, living under the siege. Mm-hmm. So it's not that it's costless, but the general schemes by these two states that are lined up against us are not giving them the results that they want.
Okay. Well, Eric, thanks again for your time.
It's a pleasure.
And thank you for joining us on CivilNet.